we'll finish things up here with our study of Hinduism with just one more video about kind of practices within Hinduism, and also a brief discussion of some contemporary important figures within Hinduism over the last century. So first, I've typed here Hindu marriages and weddings. These are very important life cycle moments for Hindus. Of course, there are others. For most religions, there are life cycle rituals even associated with birth, and there are within traditional Hinduism. In fact, there are even life cycle rituals associated with conception within Hinduism. Certain words, prayers that should be recited as one seeks to conceive. And then if one does, then there will be other rituals attached to the moment of birth. And of course, we also already mentioned the Upanayana, the initiation ritual into the student stage of life, in an earlier video talking about the various stages of student life, of Hindu life. Here we can talk about the next kind of major life cycle moment for most Hindus, and this is when one gets married to someone else. And again, historically, as in many different cultures and societies, marriages occurred relatively early in life for most Hindus, when people were simply young teenagers, for example. And as is the case for most societies and cultures, historically, many Hindu marriages have been arranged. Now again, like in most other cultures and societies, we're moving away from this within Hinduism. And most Hindus that you would meet in the United States, for example, or even in urban settings in India, will not have arranged marriages and will not be getting married at 14 or 15. They will be dating and living kind of social lifestyles that are more or less similar to the average kind of lifestyle of other Americans. But historically, you did have these arranged marriages, and often astrology was used to assist in arranging the marriage of your child with another child. And this is still sometimes used today, especially in rural settings. You could go to certain websites that would help find good matches for your child as they're making their way into their teenage years to assist you in arranging a proper marriage. Again, historically, many of these individuals would not really know each other at all. If you watch the film Gandhi, for example, when they talk about their wedding ceremony, they say that they really didn't know each other before having the arranged marriage done by their parents. So this is a historical way that things have happened in Hinduism as well as in many other cultures and societies, as we're kind of moving away from that as time continues. When it comes to the wedding itself, there are some very interesting features of a traditional Hindu wedding, some of which continue in some traditional Hindu families to this day and some of which do not. Traditionally, there is a moment of the giving away of the bride. Again, this makes sense given some of the gender issues that we have seen within Hinduism. We know that women had a sense of a higher status, maybe in the Vedic time period, kind of had to take that step back thanks to the laws of Manu and the Dharma Shastras and some of the gender discrimination at place there. And while we saw important moments for women in terms of bhakti, when you think of the female alvar, and also with modern reform, obviously like pretty much every other place on the planet, women are still continuing to this day to fight for more and more equality. So the notion that the woman has to be given away by her father as if she cannot be independent, she has to move from being the daughter of this man to then being the wife of this other man, that shows some of the male dominance, the patriarchalism of the Hindu society. Now again, most weddings that probably most of you have attended, even in a place like the United States, also probably has had this moment of the giving away of the bride. I don't think we often think of its kind of patriarchal kind of undertones at this moment in history. We maybe think of it as just a time for everybody to get to admire the beauty of the bride. But if you do step back and think about it a little bit, the groom is up there kind of by himself with his friends. Nobody has to usher him in. Nobody has to give him away in many weddings. The bride does have to be given away, often by the father primarily, even if the mother also accompanies the bride and the father. So you have that in traditional Hindu weddings. There will be a giving of traditionally a necklace to the bride from the groom's family, so something similar of the ring that we have in many kind of American wedding circumstances, you would have the necklace that is given. The groom is sometimes given a certain piece of fabric or something else to signify the marriage. Later in the ceremony, you will have the very important and pivotal moment of the bride and the groom to be walking around fire together. And fire is seen as a necessary witness to a traditional Hindu wedding. Remember, we think back to the fire altars of the Indus Valley civilization, and I told you that we would see fire maintain a place of importance throughout Hinduism, whether it was with the sacrifices of non-human animals that existed from the very early days of the Vedas and continue to exist to this day, or with cremation, which happens with death rituals, or here as the witness to a traditional Hindu wedding. So they walk around this fire, and as they're doing so, they're reciting deeply religious language, largely focused on Vishnu, whom you'll remember in the Trimurti is the god of preservation. So there is a sense where you're asking Vishnu, who preserves everything, to preserve the marriage. And it's very, in some ways, romantic language of the bride and groom walking around this fire, the groom asking the bride to be his friend, to have a life together, to build a life together, to procreate and to have children. And of course, you have to remember that in many traditional settings, the two would have hardly known each other. Obviously, that's different from most Hindus getting married today. But that importance of walking around the fire and praying to Vishnu, seeking his guidance and his preserving power for the marriage is very important. And then later at night, traditionally, the bride and groom will go outside and the priest will show them a particular cluster of stars and show them how these stars never move apart from each other. They've always remained that close together. And in the same way, the priest is then asking that this marriage remain like those stars, that the man and the woman will remain close to each other. This is something that, again, happened in traditional Hindu weddings and may or may not be occurring as some of these traditions are left behind by more kind of urban or Hindus that have moved outside of India, etc., and left behind some of these traditions. Right? I did mention the death rituals. Obviously, the end of the life cycle of rituals that occurs within the standard Hindu life. And again, cremation through fire is the standard ritual at this moment. Some may be buried, but most will be cremated as the standard ritual for death. And then finally here, I've mentioned just a couple of names in terms of important religious figures in the last 100 years. Sai Baba is a very interesting figure. He died just a few years ago, maybe around 2010, 2011. He was a very well-renowned religious teacher within Hinduism. All kinds of people, especially in India, but really around the world, followed the teachings of Sai Baba. And you can look him up and go to his websites and find teachings and audio messages from Sai Baba. He was very well revered by leading politicians in India, and actors and actresses and average people were very all interested in the teachings of Sai Baba. And it's just a good example of the importance of religious teachers really throughout all of Hinduism, but even to this very day in the contemporary setting. One of the things that gave Sai Baba a great kind of deal of interest among people is the miracles that he would perform. And you can look up on YouTube, usually there you find videos of where people are trying to discount miracles or things being done by magicians, for example, and you see that with some of the Sai Baba videos. But often he would be giving a teaching and all of a sudden he would start gagging, and then all of a sudden something would come out of his mouth, maybe a little kind of gold ball that looks kind of like a Christmas tree ornament or something like this. Or he might have been walking around while doing a teaching, and if you look up pictures of him, he often had this kind of wild frizzy hair, and he would reach into his hair and pull out a gold watch or something like this and hand it away. So very interesting things that were going on in some of his seminars. All kinds of money poured into the Sai Baba organization and a lot of money poured out of it for good causes. But a very interesting figure, one worth looking up if you want to dig in a little bit to contemporary religious leaders within the Hindu tradition. And then, of course, Gandhi, who is a little bit earlier in the 20th century. Most of us are familiar with Gandhi. Some of us in America are familiar with Gandhi because of the way Gandhi's work influenced the life and work of Martin Luther King Jr. in his struggle for civil rights for African Americans in the middle of the 20th century. King was very indebted to the kind of non-violent approach used by Gandhi to fight for Indian independence from the British. And just a couple of key words that were so central to Gandhi that Martin Luther King Jr. will make use of in the American setting. The first is ahimsa, which is translated as non-violence. We'll see that term show up again when we start looking at Buddhism. But for Gandhi, again, violence was not the answer, right? He was very committed to non-violent resistance. And that's something that Martin Luther King Jr. would take over and use in his struggle for civil rights in America. And then the second term here, satyagraha, which is translated as truth force. Again, the idea is that we're not focused on the force of weapons or punches or things like that. We're focused on the force that truth itself has. And that gave Gandhi a sense of purpose and mission going forward, knowing that truth was on his side. Martin Luther King Jr. will use that terminology to think about his own faith, in his case, in kind of divine providence in marching forward for the search for justice. So Gandhi is a very important figure who was very central to the fight for Indian independence, which has then created the independent India that we know today, and also, of course, included eventually some of the partitioning off of Pakistan, even though Gandhi worked very much to try to bring Hindus and Muslims together so that they could cooperate in establishing a more just society for all people. So that concludes our study of the Hindu tradition, and soon we'll get started and look at Buddhism, the second of our Eastern traditions that also originated on the Indian subcontinent.